Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Welcome to the first edition of Toronto Baseball Tales. So we're going to spend, yeah, 4 weekly lectures diving into the history of the sport. Very excited to get started. Thanks to Sergio and the Toronto Public Library for having us. And this week, we're going to start our journey by heading back to the story of the city's very first baseball championship. We're currently, as we're doing this Zoom, just a week away from the beginning of another Jays season. But the history of the sport in our city goes back much, much further to that than that snowy day in 1977, which we're going to get to by the end of these 4 talks. I figured to kick things off, we kind of go back to the beginning and start making our way through these lectures a little bit chronologically. And so that's what we're going to do today. For the next hour or so, we're going to dive into the strange story of Toronto's first baseball championship, which takes us all the way back to Toronto in the late 1800s. And I thought that this image would be a good place to start, because even though it doesn't necessarily look like it at a glance, this is actually the very earliest known image of a baseball stadium in our city's history. So this is a bird's eye view from the 1890s. The way they did it was they went basically door to door, sort of collecting drawings, I believe, of every building in Toronto, and then stitching them all together into this huge aerial view of the city and the surrounding countryside. And as a result, it's filled with all sorts of detail, including, if you look very closely at the east end of the city, an image of our first baseball stadium, the first baseball grounds specifically built to house a baseball team. And so it was here on the banks of the Don Valley, as you can see just on sort of the right-hand side of this photo right here. I'll circle it for you. This is the Toronto Baseball Grounds, which would become nicknamed Sunlight Park, which is where the team that won our city's first baseball championship played the year it won the pennant. And that team and the story of how they won that championship is a deeply weird one. It comes from an era when baseball was still seen as an incredibly scandalous sport, played by people who were dismissed by sort of the upper classes in our city as undesirables. And this professional team was filled with these infamous figures. So we're going to meet the pitching ace of the Toronto staff, who became a notorious alcoholic, who was forever getting up to no good with his troublemaking pet monkey. The first baseman, who was so intimidating and angry that the Globe newspaper declared that he shouldn't be allowed on a baseball field without wearing a muzzle. And one of the catchers, who's much more famous for being, in fact, a con artist and the most wanted man in North America. These players and more made up this championship team, dismissed as undesirables. And in the process of sort of digging into this story, I think there's a lot we can learn about Toronto and its history and how it worked here in the 1800s. So, to understand the story of this team and its championship, it helps actually rewind even further than this and sort of follow the line through to set the scene for this championship season. So let's go back all the way to the founding of Toronto. This is what downtown Toronto looked like the week that the city was founded, in July of 1793. Now, it's a place that, as Sergio mentioned in the intro, was already home to people for thousands and thousands of years at this point. The Wendat, nations of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas, when the British arrived to build that little town of York that would become the city of Toronto. And we can see in this painting of the Toronto Bay back then by the founder of Toronto, John Graves Simcoe's wife, Elizabeth, the tents that were pitched during the construction of Fort York, those white squares and triangles, the masts of the British warships on the left. And sports were going to be a part of this new settlement right from the very beginning. Now, people had already, of course, been playing sports in this place for as long as anyone can remember. Lacrosse was based on even older games than that and would become popular with the settlers who lived here. Is said to have maybe even influenced a little bit the evolution of baseball and certainly hockey in Canada as well. And when those settlers arrived, they brought a lot of their own sports with them too. In fact, the founders of Toronto, including the Simcoes, might already have been familiar with the word baseball by the time they showed up in the late 1700s. The sport we know today and recognize as modern baseball isn't invented for a few decades after the city is founded, but the word was already in use. The very first time we get it in a written format was all the way back in 1744, so like 50 years before Toronto was founded, written here in this little pretty pocketbook, as it was called. And we know, too, that the settlers who arrived in the late 1700s, very early 1800s, were playing ball games, too. In fact, one of the early settlers, this guy Eli Plater, wrote in his diary that he went to town, walked around, and joined, as he put it, a number of men jumping and playing ball. So we'll never know exactly what that ball game was, but it is the era when sort of versions of baseball are just sort of starting to evolve a little bit. Old games like rounders and other ball games that you can trace back in Europe till the 1300s, 1200s even. What we do know about Toronto in this era when it was the town of York is that British sports in particular were really set up to play a leading role. York was founded to be an incredibly British place, and sports were going to play a big role in that. In the days before baseball, and hockey, the big public sports weren't really public at all. They were mostly for the town's elites, and they were mostly very British sports. So our oldest clubs were founded all in the early 1800s for these old British games like cricket and curling, fox hunting too. The Toronto Hunt Club was founded way back in the 1840s. And they were founded very much with the idea of British culture and the British class system in mind, which is where baseball's going to come in. Because people wrote very openly about games like cricket being good for establishing that kind of British class system. The Toronto Patriot newspaper said that British feelings couldn't flow into the breasts of our Canadian boys through a more delightful or untainted channel than that of British sports, and that this was also about class and about politics, that a cricketer playing this old British game, as a matter of course, detested democracy and was staunch in his allegiance to his king. That cricket was supposed to counter sort of the revolutionary values of the United States and France and reinforce these British values instead, values that they were going to feel that baseball ended up challenging before too long. And so in these days, in the middle of the 1800s, just as baseball is starting to evolve on both sides of the border, sports in Toronto are almost exclusively for the wealthiest residents in our city. It's all through these private members clubs that don't let any working class people in at all. You are forced to pay membership dues to help keep the riffraff out. There are the equipment costs as well. There are dress codes and codes of conduct. And there's the length of a game like cricket too, which keeps the working class from playing it, because a game of cricket could take 3 days to play, and any working class Torontonian isn't going to have that much free time. This is an era before labor unions and the 8-hour workday, when people are working like 12-hour, 14-hour days, 6 days a week. They only get Sunday off. And the people in power in Toronto made sure that it was illegal to play sports on Sunday, the one day working class people had to pay them, by making all sorts of things illegal in Toronto on Sundays through most of the city's history. Very much, I think, not coincidentally, the Lord's Day Act being brought in to ban things like sports on Sundays, not long after the big rebellion in the 1830s, because the people running the city don't want working class people getting to hang out together, play sports, and maybe start chatting about society and changing some things about it. So that's when baseball comes along, and it's revolutionary. Suddenly, there's a sport that you can play, and lacrosse is another one, where you only need 2 or 3 hours to play it, not like 3 days. Suddenly, there's a sport that the working class can play, that they have the time for. You can sneak it in before the sun sets after work. And it's hard to believe now, I know, but it was at the time the fast-paced, energetic, urban game that went by in the blink of an eye. Mark Twain famously said that baseball was the very symbol, the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. And so this was a game for people who didn't have a lot of time, but still wanted to play. The very earliest recorded game of baseball that we, I believe, have found in the records is a game that was organized in 1859 at the University of Toronto. This is the notice that was published in the Globe, announcing that people had formed something they called the Canadian Pioneer Baseball Club. They had a president, a secretary, a treasurer, and that they were going to practice every week on the grounds of the university. Though you'll notice too that the time they're practicing is Monday at 4 p.m. So it seems likely that these are either students or people with enough privilege and wealth to be able to not be working some factory job at Monday at 4. But while these are the origins, the sport in Toronto did become deeply associated with the working class very, very quickly. Most baseball players in Toronto in the 1800s were working class, which was the only sport that could be said about at the time. Lots of the players live in the ward, that neighborhood that gained a reputation for being a notorious slum because of the predatory landlords there, and was eventually demolished to make way for Nathan Phillips Square and the new City Hall. And unions, labor unions, also start embracing sports at the same time that they really start organizing and pushing for shorter work days and more time off. Sports end up being a way that people can build solidarity, just as people running things worried they might. And as they started winning some of those battles and getting shorter work days, it meant more and more people had time to play a game of baseball. But it ended up being still incredibly stratified as a sport. In Toronto, in the middle and late 1800s, right up to the era when we win this first baseball championship, different sports are for different classes of people in Toronto. Cricket is for the wealthy, lacrosse for white-collar workers, and blue-collar workers, they're the ones playing baseball. And people write really openly about the fact that they look down on baseball players as rough and uncouth and immoral. One lacrosse player in our city said that baseball players didn't seem to develop their moral attributes to any great extent. And another writer in the middle of that century explained it pretty clearly, that cricket was for elders lacrosse was for younger socialites, but baseball was just a sandlot sport played by undesirables. And that reputation was really at the front of people's minds and spread. It wasn't just Toronto, it was all over the place. This is not long before one of the most famous and infamous photos of old-timey baseball players, which is the Boston team, including old Hoss Radburn, who does a good job of summing this all up in one gesture by giving the photographer the finger back in the 1800s. One of the most celebrated figures in the whole history of the sport, the legendary A's manager, Connie Mack, said that back then in the 1800s, the era we're talking about, baseball was thought by solid, respectable people to be only 1 degree above grand larceny, arson, and mayhem, and those who engaged with it were beneath the notice of decent society. But some people who had money in Toronto were starting to take notice, and that's what really sets the scene for our first successful professional team. This is the late 1800s. The Industrial Revolution is really arriving in Toronto, and new technologies are unleashing the potential for people to make money off baseball now. We've got streetcars, which means that people can travel through the city more easily and get to games. We've got trains that mean for the first time, really, you're able to have professional leagues where one city can play another city and travel there and back pretty quickly. We've got telegraphs too, which means you can now get the results almost instantaneously, and steam-powered printing presses to then print those results in newspapers. And sports are becoming more accessible because you're getting mass manufactured sporting equipment too by companies like the Spalding Company. And so the era of baseball as business begins. The very first sporting event in Toronto history that made any money made it by accident. And it was a lacrosse game between the Toronto Lacrosse Club and the Six Nations, held on the lacrosse grounds in Rosedale. Some sporting events charged admission, mostly just to cover expenses. And this game was so popular that they accidentally made more money than they needed to, and they ended up with a profit. They ended up donating that money to charity, but people noticed that there was this potential now to come away with more money than you put in. And the baseball world was very much noticing that at the very same time. It's only 2 years after that lacrosse game in Rosedale that the baseball world gets its very first professional team ever, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, who then end up sort of disbanding and reforming in Boston. And part of how they make money is traveling from city to city, challenging local teams, including one of the local teams in Toronto. We had more and more teams being formed during this era. The big one was the Toronto Dauntless, the most famous professional team in the world, Boston Red Stockings, ended up coming to town, taking on the Toronto Dauntless, and absolutely annihilating them the first time they played in 1872 by a score of 68-0. Though we would eventually get our revenge, because the Red Stockings would eventually end up moving to Atlanta, and Toronto would beat them for the World Series in 1992, that same team we lost to 68-0 back in 1872. So in this era, teams are starting to make money off these kinds of big match games, these high-profile matchups, and off sort of tournaments and winning prize money at the end of them as well. And that leads to our establishing in Toronto teams like the Red Stockings for the first time. So just a few years after the Red Stockings come here and beat the pants off the Dauntless, we get our first real professional league in Canada, and we have a Toronto team in that league, the Toronto Clippers. By then, people are saying that baseball is catching on like wildfire, especially sort of in Western and Northern Ontario, that it's probably the most popular sport in those places. But this league only lasts 1 year before it folds, and we end up waiting a decade before we get our first championship team. It's born here on King Street at the Rawson House Hotel, which stood right at King and York. So just right in the heart of downtown, just a block or two from Union Station. In fact, it's right across kitty corner from one of the places that I know some of the current Blue Jay players stay when they're in town. And a bunch of sort of elite Torontonians, wealthy Torontonians, have a big meeting here to help found a new league and a Torontonian team to go with it. And some of these owners of what they're going to very imaginatively call the Toronto Baseball Club are very respectable people with high reputations. The deputy police chief is one of them. There's a big temperance leader who's part of the meeting too. But even this team's owners are going to include some pretty disreputable Torontonians as well. There's E. Strawn Cox, a lawyer who's about to get caught up in a big scandalous fraud trial, accused himself of it, not just representing someone. There's Peter Ryan, who I've heard described as a diamond-studded tavern owner, who also becomes a city council member. And worst of all, there's Thomas Hunter, who's literally a Confederate who fought for the South on the side of slavery during the American Civil War. And race is going to be a big part of this team too, as we're going to talk about before we're done today. And so they set up this Toronto Baseball Club to play in this new Canadian league that's founded in 1885. London's in it, Guelph's in it, but Toronto doesn't do very well at all. They finish, I think it might even be fourth, which is last place. And the local press thinks the whole thing's just an embarrassment. This team's going to end up winning a championship just 2 years later, but it gets off to a terrible start. The Globe says that they made the people of Toronto look ridiculous, that our city was not accustomed to this sort of thing, and that part of it was sort of immoral behavior. They said that if the Toronto Baseball Club was going to stick around for next year, that they really hoped that this time its members would be properly managed, regardless of the welfare of any gambling parasites that might attach themselves to the team and try to control its destinies, suggesting pretty heavily that Toronto Baseball Club, our first really big professional team, was throwing games and rigging the results in their very first season. 2 years later, they get us our first championship. And they do that in another new league. They leave the Canadian teams behind. George Sleeman, the owner of the Guelph team, the famous brewer, tries to sue them because Guelph's not invited to be part of the International League, which is where Toronto will play for the next, 70 years, 80 years after this, all the way until the 1960s, right up basically until the point when we're on the verge of getting into the majors for the first time. The International League becomes one of the big minor leagues. It's still around today. It's the one that the Buffalo Bisons, our AAA affiliate for the Jays, still play in today. And it's International League because it is an international league. In these early days especially, there are teams on both sides of the border, some of them with absolutely wonderful names. The Buffalo Bisons are there from the start. Strange names like the Utica Pentups and the Jersey City Skeeters, the Oswego Starch Boxes and the Hamilton Hams. Toronto, we stick with our plain Toronto Baseball Club, nicknamed the Torontos creatively. And some sources seem to suggest that they were also called the Canucks. I can't find any newspaper reports from the time have called them that I've seen so far. So the International League, one of the biggest minor leagues, is where the Torontos are going to be playing for a long time to come, and it's where they're going to win that championship. Which brings us back to where we started, to Sunlight Park on the banks of the Don River, right at the corner of Queen and Broadview. In fact, there's a little baseball-themed parquet there and a little street or laneway named Baseball Place. That's the same spot the stadium stood on all the way back in the late 1800s, and then a little into the early 1900s too. It was officially known as the baseball grounds, but was nicknamed Sunlight Park because the Sunlight Soapworks factory, the Unilever plant, was right next door. And so that branding sort of got associated with it. And it was this first time that we had a baseball facility of our own. Admission was a quarter. You could pay an extra dime to sit under the big grandstand that had seating for 2,000 people. I think a dime more, and you could get a cushion for your seat. The standing room was another 10,000 people on top of that, which means that a sellout at Sunlight Park was something like 10% of the entire population of the city. So, like a Jays game, getting like 300,000 people in attendance. And this is where these big dramatic moments would start happening, beginning in 1886. So the year after the Canadian League and all the gambling scandals, that's when the new baseball grounds open. They begin the season at those old lacrosse grounds in Rosedale and have their grand opening in May once Sunlight Park is ready for it. And that opening ceremony for the very first day sort of shows us how much the city's leaders are starting to embrace this sport, even though it still has this very scandalous reputation. In fact, the first pitch at that first game at that stadium was thrown by the lieutenant governor himself, John Beverly Robinson II, who is about as establishment a figure as you could possibly find in Toronto history. His dad was one of the big leaders of the family compact, the insular group of elites that ran Toronto and tried to keep it incredibly British and incredibly beneficial to themselves for ages. He served the governor during the rebellion, helping to put down Mackenzie's rebels. And he was a star cricket player too, very much invested in that idea of these British sports. At Upper Canada College, he was even part of the very first international sporting event in history, which is hard to believe, but that's what all the historians seem to say, is that the first game of cricket between Canada and the United States, which included Robinson, is the first international sporting match of all time. Robinson's there playing cricket during that moment, representing the province of Canada as it was back then. He's a member of the Orange Order too, that deeply Protestant fraternal society that keeps a stranglehold on Toronto politics for the next century to come nearly. And he is himself also a former mayor. So about as establishment a figure as you can possibly imagine, winding up to throw out the first ceremonial pitch at Sunlight Park. He stayed and watched the game. They say someone in his entourage had a hat knocked off by a foul ball. And you get this moment that shows that the sport, thanks to its business potential, is being embraced by people of all classes, even though it seems mostly to be the ruffians who are the ones playing it. And that's very much what's happening with Sunlight Park and with that team that plays there in 1886, and then maybe even more so, the one that plays the next year, 1887, which is the year they're going to win the pennant for the very first time. So at this point, Toronto's a big, booming Victorian metropolis, more than 100,000 people living here and more arriving all the time. These new technologies, new stuff getting built, the city expanding all the time. And the baseball team is going to become one of the rallying points for the city's civic identity. And that's despite the fact that these players are so spectacularly rough around the edges. Take, for instance, Jay Fats, our first baseman. He's nicknamed the captain, Captain Fats. So I think that's in part because he sort of served as a de facto captain for the team. He's the one so angry the Globe thought he needed to be muzzled. They said that he seemed to deem it his duty to introduce discord and unpleasantness on every opportunity and on every shallow pretext that his ingenuity could devise, that it would be a wise thing to make sure that he was muzzled before going out on the field. The only problem would be that he would then be so furious at being muzzled that he would probably spontaneously combust and die, which would be a shame because his only defect was that his tongue was even longer than his body. Since he was a very tall first baseman, that means his tongue was wagging a very long way indeed. And he does seem, when you read the game stories from this year, to be getting into trouble and picking fights all the time. And his big nemesis is this guy. This is the very first professional baseball umpire ever. The guy who first got paid to ump the very first big professional major league, I believe, game, Billy McLean. He and Fats did not get along at all. In fact, there's one big game at the end of the 1887 season, right in the thick of the pennant race, when the Torontos are fighting for first place, when McLean and Fats get into a fight over the fact that the baseballs they're using for this game haven't been signed by the chairman of the league like they're supposed to have been. And so they have a big meeting and decide what to do. And they all agree that they're going to use these balls, including the captain, Fats. He signs off on this. But when the game starts, Fats gets a hit, gets on base, and decides he wants someone else to run for him. And McLean says, no, that's not how baseball works. You can't just have someone temporarily come in and run in your stead. And Fats then says, well, if we're sticking by the rules, then why are we playing with these illegal baseballs? Let's stop playing altogether. McLean and Fats then get into a big disagreement that ends with Fats refusing to play anymore, and McLean seemingly refusing to allow him to be subbed out for anyone else. So for the rest of the game, the rest of the Toronto club, who doesn't seem to take Fats's side, their teammate's side in it at all, they decide to keep playing the game without their first baseman and their captain, with just 8 fielders out there catching the balls. And every time Fats comes up to bat, he just stays sullenly pouting in the dugout, and McLean, the umpire, calls him out every time. McLean had that kind of reputation for being a real no-nonsense umpire. There's another game Toronto plays in Buffalo against the Bisons during this pennant race, where McLean makes some calls that anger the Bisons fans. And at the end of the game, they end up spilling out onto the field and surrounding the umpire threateningly, 500 of them. And he ends up needing a police escort and to maybe even throw a punch or two to make his way through that angry mob. He, which was useful in this situation, had been a boxer before he became an umpire. And in Toronto, too, he ended up having big disagreements with local fans, as I'm sure you can imagine. And Toronto's fans had a very similar reputation to the one that their players they were cheering for had. The Globe said in one game during the season that McLean deserved better support from the audience, from the crowd, that the hoodlums of Toronto at Sunlight Park that day were even more boisterous and pig-headed than usual. There was another game where McLean threatened to shut the whole thing down if the crowd didn't sort of tamp down their enthusiasm and their aggravatingly boisterous nature, as the Globe put it, who threatened to just end the game right there and leave if the Toronto crowd didn't quiet down a bunch. And the crowd, well, it wasn't just about ragging on umpires or good-natured banter with opposing players or a little bit of sort of tongue-in-cheek heckling. Sometimes the crowd in Toronto could be truly vicious and truly disturbingly racist as well. I said that race was going to be a big part of this new team, and there was one race in particular people had in mind. The Toronto Baseball Club was meant for white men. The lieutenant governor, when he threw out that ceremonial first pitch at that first game, had actually given a speech where race was a central feature of it. He had said that it always pleased him to see all classes of Anglo-Saxons entering into athletics, and that it was part of the spirit, part of the manly, sturdy characteristics which distinguished that race. And the Toronto Baseball Club, as you might imagine from a club that's co-owned by a literal Confederate, would be a very racist organization and push that vision forward, sometimes incredibly aggressively. In fact, Toronto played one of the leading roles in the creation of baseball's color barrier, and they did it during that first championship season of 1887. Now, there were no black players on the Torontos, so there were 7 or 8 of them playing in the International League, all for other clubs. The only black employee of the Toronto Baseball Club was a boy that they hired as a mascot, as they called him, which is something that teams did back then. This image is from the 1900s of a team in Nashville doing the same thing. The Toronto club ended up picking up a boy named Willie Hume on the road and having him travel along with them through the 1886 season, so the one before the championship year, their first year at Sunlight Park. They dressed him up in sort of a snazzy uniform and they seem to have had him spit on their bats and their equipment for good luck. They eventually fired him when they decided that he wasn't lucky enough and that he was not showing up on time, and ended up just leaving him on the road in whatever city they happened to be in. And that kind of thing speaks, I think, to kind of the spirit behind the team in some ways. There are lots of stories of horrifyingly racist things happening at Sunlight Park. This is one of those black players. This is a pitcher for the Syracuse Stars named Robert Higgins, who faced horrifying racism even from his own teammates. And that May of the championship year, early in the season, while the Torontos were still off to a very slow start, he came to Sunlight Park and found that his own teammates basically abandoned him in the pitcher's box, as it was back then, before they had a mound. It was a box and flat ground you'd throw off. During that game at Sunlight Park against the Torontos, his fielders purposefully started making errors in order to throw the game because they didn't want to be playing behind a black pitcher. They ended up losing 28-8 that day, and 21 of the runs were unearned that the Torontos scored. Even one of our most conservative newspapers, the Toronto World, called it disgraceful baseball. And other players in the league faced equally, if not even more, horrifying things. The best black player in the International League was quite possibly the best baseball player, period. This is Frank Grant, who played second base for the Bisons. At least one baseball historian calls him literally the greatest ball player of that entire era. But he too didn't find support from fellow players, both on his own team and others, or from fans as well. Pitchers, they say half the pitchers in the league made a habit of throwing directly at his head and refusing to throw him anything he could hit. Players coming into second base did it spikes high to try to injure him and drive their spikes through his shins. Another black second baseman ended up starting to wear shin guards made out of wood in an attempt to fend off the same kind of attacks. His own teammates, the year before this one was taken, had refused to take a team photo with him in it at all. They say, too, they had attacked him once. He had to fend off the attack with a club. And in Toronto, when the Bisons came to Sunlight Park in July of 1887, that championship year, people were hurling literal bigoted death threats in his direction using the N-word as part of them. In fact, one leading baseball historian wrote decades ago that in this era, the most vociferous opposition to integrated baseball, the most passionate support for the idea of segregation, it came from our city. It came from Toronto, from the club, and from its fans. And this was a pivotal year in the history of racism in baseball. That, I believe it's August. I could be getting the date wrong. There's a day during that season when the team from Newark of the International League were hosting a big exhibition game against one of the teams from the National League, the major leagues. One of the star players of the Newark Little Giants was their catcher, Fleet Walker, who was the very first Black player to ever play in the major leagues before the color barrier was introduced. And you'd have to wait until Jackie Robinson came along to break it and reintegrate Major League Baseball. And it began with this game in a lot of ways, because on the White Stockings was one of baseball's most notorious bigots, Cap Anson, who refused to play that day unless Moses Fleetwood Walker wasn't allowed to play. And Newark ended up backing down and benching Walker so that they could still get all the gate receipts, all the profit from the game, having this famous team, the White Stockings, maybe the most famous team in the world at the time, come to town. And the very same day that that was happening, the Toronto Ball Club was involved in a meeting in Buffalo, here at the Genesee Hotel, to talk about introducing a color barrier into the International League, introducing a ban on the signing of any more Black players. Anyone who was already in the league would be grandfathered in, but no team would be allowed to sign anyone Black from that moment on. They took a big vote, and they were divided nearly down the middle. 6 of the 10 teams voted for the ban. 4 of the teams voted against it. The 4 teams who voted against were all teams that already had Black players. The 6 teams that voted for the introduction of the color barrier were the teams that didn't, including the Toronto Baseball Club, who are said to have been one of the real leaders of the vote and one of the real champions of the idea of a color barrier. This was the first league to introduce one, and it's said to then have helped inspire the major leagues to do the same, with Toronto right in the middle of it. It's, as the Newark Daily Journal put it, the moment the color line was drawn in baseball, despite the fact that many people were horrified by it. And it's not that just all the white people of the age believed in this racism. The Newark Daily Journal writing that Moses Walker was clearly mentally and morally the equal of anybody who voted in favor of that motion. And you might imagine actually quite a lot superior morally to them as well. So this is the moment that you have segregation arrive, which leads to the founding of the Negro Leagues and the color barrier being in place for the next 60, 70 years before Jackie Robinson arrives to break it, something he starts doing in the International League, playing for the Montreal Royals, the very same league that had first introduced that line back at that meeting that Toronto attended in 1887. Now, the drive to the championship that year, as I say, got off to a very slow start. The Torontos were in 4th place by the time the end of August approached. And the winning streak started in pretty unremarkable fashion. It was against, I believe, yes, Rochester, when a pretty close game happened to break Toronto's way. The umpiring seemed to be a little favorable to the Toronto side. Just one more win in a season that was peppered with wins and losses. But then they ended up winning the next game, and then the game after that as well. That's the one where that angry crowd in Buffalo surrounded the umpire. And they just kept winning after that. And a lot of their star players were playing incredibly central roles. Another one of the most notorious is Cannonball Crane, who was the ace of the pitching staff. The guy who would become a notorious alcoholic in seasons to come was at the absolute top of his game. He's said to have thrown a ball harder than anyone else, to have the fastest fastball in baseball at the time, and a deceptive drop ball and other breaking pitches that absolutely baffled opposing hitters. He threw a ball further than anyone else, too, 400 feet, which at the time was the world record, which meant that he was also valuable in the field. And when he wasn't pitching, which most often he was, he'd play center field, sometimes second base, and had a gun of an arm out there in center as well. And they wanted to keep it his bat in the lineup was an important part of it too. He ended up hitting 428 that year, although it is a year where they counted walks as hits, so it's basically his on-base percentage. But if it were his batting average, it would be a record for all professional pitchers in the history of baseball. And if he'd done it in the majors, would be the sixth highest ever. And even as an OBP, 428 is nothing to sneeze at, especially for a pitcher who's leading your pitching staff. He was pitching day after day as this winning streak started. Most games were being pitched by him, and most of the games he started, he finished. In fact, every single game he started, he finished. There wasn't a reliever in sight. He even shut down the Syracuse Stars entirely one day, which led to a wonderful description in the Globe, saying that it was due to a very marked lack of courtesy and neighborly feeling that Crane hadn't allowed any of the Syracuse Stars the pleasure of hitting the ball very much yesterday. Wonderful description of a shutout, I think. And as he kept pitching, the Torontos kept winning. 4 games and then 5, 6, 7, 8. It was now a 9-game winning streak. And everything was firing on all cylinders, like the best moments last year with our Jays. Their offense was on fire. The Globe said that there was nothing the Torontos in their present mood wouldn't slug. They were a fast team, too. In fact, they had the fastest guy in baseball, Mike Slattery, who ended up stealing 112 bases that year. After one game, the Globe simply wrote, Slattery stole second. He always does. One of those 112. Though that's also a little bit misleading because they were counting stats a little differently for stolen bases too, and they counted taking an extra base. Like if you went first to third, that would be a stolen base as well. Although 112 in the 101 games they played that year is still an incredible rate. That makes him one of the great all-time base stealers. In fact, that 112 is still the International League record. He was stealing more than a base a game on average. And to give you a sense of how that compares, Ricky Henderson's average was about half a bag per game throughout his career, though he was, of course, taking lots of extra bases as well. Not only was the pitching great, the defense was too. One game, they turned a triple play during that winning streak. And in that same game, I believe, Crane made an incredible catch in the outfield and then an incredibly brainy play as well, what the Globe called a fumble of malice aforethought, where he purposely fumbled the ball in center field to trick the runner into going home, at which point Crane gunned him down at home plate, throwing a grand unerring throw to Decker at the home plate. And Decker, the guy who was catching that ball, was often Crane's battery mate. He was kind of the backup catcher who would play the field the rest of the time. It was this guy, Harry Decker, who is probably the single most notorious member of this Toronto team. He was an incredibly talented player, but he was arguably an even more incredibly talented con artist. Now, Decker, he'd grown up in Chicago as one of the hot young prospects in that city. He signed his first professional contract while he was still a teenager and is said to have had an incredible amount of promise that was pretty much squandered right from the very beginning. One of his early stories is how he quit on his team in Indianapolis halfway through a game in order to leave them and defect to another league after some recruiters showed up waving dollar bills in the air, yelling out, "Hey, Harry, hey, Harry." He ended up pretending to get hurt in the finger, catching a ball awkwardly on purpose so he could claim he was hurt and couldn't play anymore, ran off to join the other league and never came back. And when that league folded, found himself banned from the majors for a while. And there were lots of other schemes that got him in tons of trouble too. One of my favorite stories is that leading into the 1887 season, he had actually tried to sign with three different teams all at the same time so he could cash the signing checks. The problem is he cashed two of those checks, two of the three from Washington, Rochester, and Toronto, at a bank in Washington where the bank teller happened to be a former member of the board of directors of the Washington team, and so recognized what Decker was trying to do. He then attempted to pretend like there were three different catchers all signing with different teams. He was caught the second time because he gave a false address, which was just an empty lot. When the team turned up to investigate, they found that empty space with Decker pacing the street, waiting for his money to arrive in the mail. At that point, he tried to claim there was still another Harry Decker who was also a Major League Baseball catcher, but didn't get away with it. And so the offers started drying up, which seems to be how he ended up on that Toronto team in 1887 to begin with. And his schemes didn't end there. He was constantly thinking of ways to make more money. He was a bit of an inventor. He invented sort of the modern catcher's mitt. Some people still call them Deckers to this day. But then he wanted quick cash for it, so he sold the patent to Al Spalding's sporting good company for cheap and missed out on the fortune he could have made from it. He also at one point sold a new kind of turnstile, a brand new invention, to the Baker Bowl, the stadium in Philadelphia, only for the Philadelphia team to realize that Decker had sold them one of their own turnstiles back to them as a new invention, having just filed off all the branding and sort of identification numbers on it before selling it back. He once took advantage of Al Spalding himself by forging Spalding's signature. He once forged a check, and then when he was arrested by a U.S. Marshal for it, Decker forged the Marshal's signature to try to get away with it. He was constantly stealing from roommates and teammates, horses and bicycles, suits of clothing, forging checks to buy everything from his tailoring to a hat for one of his mistresses. He was a counterfeiter and then counterfeited that signature as well. They say he even got an identifying mole removed from his face surgically to make sure he'd be less easy to finger in court, and was changing his name, they say, every time he got on a train in order to avoid the authorities who kept trying to track him down. His love life was also very similar. Married multiple women at the same time, broke the heart of the 15-year-old he married at first and had a child with, before that child died tragically at the age of 2, and Decker seems to have been deeply heartbroken by that, but didn't see himself as being at fault for all these affairs. One newspaper called him the Don Juan of the Diamond, and he blamed the women, of course. He said he was a most unfortunate man. Seemed that all he had to do was look at a girl and she'd fancy him so much that a breach of promise suit was the result. One Pinkerton detective said that he knew that the phrase, one of the most dangerous men in the country, was overused, but that it applied to Harry Decker for sure. The law would eventually catch up with him. Long after his years in Toronto, the major leagues got sick of him. In fact, not long after. They got sick of the fact he kept getting arrested, sometimes multiple times during the same season. He was finally released by the New Haven Nutmegs and kind of disappeared from the historical record. No one was sure what had happened to him until many, many years later, when the Los Angeles Angels paid a visit to San Quentin Prison and donated a bunch of uniforms to the prison baseball team. The team sent him a photo of their squad in these new uniforms, I believe, as a thank you for that gift. And someone who later saw that photo recognized one of those ball players. He was in San Quentin serving a sentence under yet another false name, but there was no mistaking that face. It was, of course, Harry Decker. At which point he disappears from the historical record again, and no one has been able to find any trace of him since. All of which was very much in the future. as that winning streak was taking place and building steam. I know we're at 12:59 now, and some of you might have the end of lunch and head back to office. Still got a little more to talk to you about, but you'll be able to find this on YouTube in probably a few weeks once it gets posted, if you have to miss the rest. And if you're able to stay on for the end of this story, wonderful. Glad to have you. So the winning streak enters September, starts in August. In the middle of September, it's still going. By a Saturday afternoon, September 17th, the winning streak is now at 11 games. There's a huge crowd at Sunlight Park that day, 7,000, 8,000 people, people piling in, paying their admission. The team has now moved from fourth place all the way into second place. And that day, that Saturday afternoon, they've got 2 games to play against their rivals for first. It's the Newark Little Giants, who have come to town for a double header. And Newark is just ahead of them in the standings. It doesn't work quite the way it does today. They go by winning percentage instead of games behind, since they all played different numbers of games than each other back then. In fact, one of the teams in the league folded halfway through the season, and not all of them got to play the same number of games against them before that team just ceased existing. So all the Torontos had to do was win one game to slip past Newark into first place. And then if they could win the second game, with only a couple of weeks left in the season, they'd really be cementing their place as the pennant leaders, heading right down into the final handful of games. It was Cannonball Crane, of course it was, who came out to pitch the first game, and he and the lineup absolutely dominated. Toronto won the first game that afternoon by a score of 15-3. Toronto was absolutely enraptured. One of the owners of the team, E. Strawn Cox, that lawyer who was about to get caught up in that fraud trial, he climbed up onto the scoreboard and wrote in big letters for everyone to see, "Citizens, are you content? Toronto leads the league." The Torontos were in first place. The Globe wrote that the crowd became basically passionately celebratory, threw the cushions from their chairs into the air, smashed their hats. But the day wasn't over. The agony, as the Globe said, continued because they needed to win that second game to stay in first place. Now, the pitcher scheduled for the afternoon was one of the other guys, really their third starter, who they seem to have barely used at all. This guy, Norm Baker, who didn't start many of these winning streak games at all, if any. It's mostly Crane and a guy named Shepard. But when the time for the second game came, it wasn't Norm Baker or even Shepard who walked out to the pitcher's box in the middle of the diamond. Instead, it was Cannonball Crane. Now, he had pitched a complete game in the first game, and everyone in the stand seems to have been confused at first. There was mostly just silence, maybe a bit of a strange muttering as people wondered what was going on. But when they realized what was happening, that Cannonball Crane was coming out to keep pitching, to keep going and start the first inning with his 10th inning pitch of the day, well, they lost it. The Globe said that hundreds of people leapt to their feet and cheered frantically. A mighty whirl of enthusiasm took everybody within its embrace, and an astounding volume of sound shook the stands and swept down toward the city and out over the grounds like the march of a tornado. Our ace was on the mound again. This time, though, the game would be much tighter. Toronto started off well, scored 3 early runs, and by the end of the third inning, we're up 3-0. But in the fourth, Cannonball Crane, when he was running the bases, injured himself. And when he came back to the pitcher's box to pitch against Newark, that seemed to be bothering him. His ankle was messed up. He was pitching wild. There were wild pitches. They were hitting him hard. And by the time he managed to get out of the fourth, he had given up 4 runs. Toronto was now losing. The Globe said that the rest of this game, from the fourth inning on, was maybe the single greatest display of baseball that had ever been performed at Sun Light Park. Both teams were absolutely on their game, and there wasn't another run scored until the fourth. Now, there are myths about what happened this day that have been repeated through generations of Torontonians about Cannonball Crane's heroics. I actually believed they were all true until about 2 days ago when I was doing some extra digging for this lecture. Some stories say that Cannonball Crane hit the game-winning or game-tying double in the eighth. It turns out that it was another hitter who got that RBI. But as they headed into the late innings, Crane was still there in the pitcher's box, still pitching, inning after inning after inning. A tie game after 8 was still a tie game after 9. It headed into extras, and Cannonball Crane kept pitching into the 10th, into the 11th. Now, the big story about Cannonball Crane is that then he hit a towering home run into the sky above the Don Valley that won the Torontos the game. It turns out that didn't happen either. And instead, the Torontos managed to score in the top of that inning, because home teams hit first back then, through a very 2025 Blue Jays kind of a way, by just hanging around, being reserved and wildly competent, and waiting for the other team to make a mistake. One Toronto hitter managed to get a double, a sacrifice fly got him to third, and then it was a pass ball that allowed him to score, so that after the top of the 11th, it was now 5-4. Cannonball Crane came out in the bottom of the 11th to pitch his 20th inning of that day. The Globe said that when he showed up in the pitcher's box for that 20th inning, he continued his marvelous career of slaughter, mowing down one little giant after another. It was a 1, 2, 3 inning inspired by a continual roar of applause. The Torontos had taken first place with some force, and they would not give it up for the rest of the season. They would end up winning 2 more games to cap their winning streak at 15 and only lose a few down the stretch that didn't really matter at all. It was that doubleheader that really seems to have cemented the Toronto's pennant for good. The scenes at Sun Light Park sound like they were unbelievable. This is the first championship in Toronto's baseball history. The Globe said it was one of the most remarkable and inspiring demonstrations ever seen on a baseball field, which might be a little biased from a Toronto paper, although we're also still in the early days of baseball, so who knows? There's not as much history as there is today. And the Globe certainly said that the crowd was into it, that the mighty audience arose and cheered and stamped and whistled and jostled and smashed hats and fired even more cushions into the air until the air itself was alive with wild gesticulation and black with moving objects upthrown by frantic hands and held aloft and dashed about on a surging wave of sound. It was, they said, a great day for ball. Cannonball Crane had written himself into the history of the city, celebrated as a hero. And a lot like the Jays today, they seem to have been seen a bit like Canada's team. They actually got the pennant that they won that year and put it at the top of a big pine tree that they stuck on a train to parade around the nation, celebrating this International League pennant that we'd managed to win over the Americans. Cannonball Crane, this Torontonian hero, though, he wouldn't be back for 1888. He did what so many stars have done to our sports teams over the years. He decided to leave immediately for the United States. He did not head to Los Angeles like many of them do, but instead to New York. And that's where his career entered its new phase in the major leagues as one of the star players on the New York Giants. That's him in the back here at the top of this little pyramid photo setup. He would help lead them to the World's Series the next year, the precursor to the World Series, and I believe the year after that as well. He was so good that he was actually invited by Al Spalding himself, the sporting goods baron and founder of the National League, owner of the Chicago White Stockings, that celebrated squad, to join an all-star world tour. Spalding wanted to show off baseball as an American pastime to the rest of the world and kind of do a very, very early version of the World Baseball Classic, try to get other people interested around the globe. And so he wanted his White Stockings to travel around the planet and play this all-star team, of which Cannonball Crane looked like he might very well be the ace. Crane agreed to sign up for the tour, met them all in San Francisco, and they headed off on this tour. They hit Australia, Sri Lanka. They ended up playing on the grounds of the Crystal Palace in London and in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower while it was still being constructed. They headed to Rome and tried to convince the authorities there to let them play a baseball game inside the Colosseum, though in the end they had to settle for the Villa Borghese, the park, instead. The place where they played is still there today. I went and visited it a few years ago. It's now a big dog park, but you can see that it used to be a track that they turned into a ball diamond for the day. They even headed to Egypt and to Cairo and to the Giza Plateau, where they played beneath the triangles of the Great Pyramid itself. They say they played a game to see if anyone could throw it all the way over the Great Pyramid of Khufu. I imagine if anyone did, it was Cannonball Crane. And they had a second contest with the Sphinx to see if anyone had an accurate enough arm to hit it with a ball in the nose. You don't need to worry. It had already lost its nose by that point. It was not Cannonball Crane who knocked it off. Though they did get to climb all over it, as you can see. Cannonball Crane is one of those two guys in the middle center of this photo. The truth is, though, that Cannonball Crane didn't really acquit himself very well on the baseball fields of the world during this tour because he was mostly drunk, or at best, hungover. When he was in San Francisco, well, they say when he arrived in that city, he had never actually had a drink in his whole life. But while he was waiting to board the ship, he had one for the first time and discovered that he quite liked it. And so he ended up spending that world tour mostly just getting drunk on board the ship. He was often too hungover to play and would either serve as a dehydrated umpire or not get off the boat at all. Spent a lot of that time hanging out with his new friend, that trouble-making pet monkey I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. It was a gift given to him by an American soldier they met in the Philippines. But that monkey really did get him into some deep water at times. At one point, the monkey nearly got him banned from France. When they were traveling from Rome to Paris and they got to the border, Crane and his monkey had pissed off some of the other passengers so much with their gallivanting about and tomfoolery that the passengers reported the monkey to the train authorities, who were told that the monkey did not have his own ticket for his seat. And so when they got to the border, the French authorities weren't going to let Crane and his monkey through unless he bought that ticket. Crane refused to buy it. And so he and the monkey both got kicked off that train, while the rest of the team carried on to Paris. In the end, he decided to back down, bought a ticket on the next train, and rejoined them. But it is the kind of stuff that he and his monkey seem to have been getting up to. And it was just the beginning of the trouble Crane would get into. His career started, sadly, nosediving after that. I think it's one more World Series the following year, but he becomes a very heavy drinker. His weight becomes a problem too. He loses the zip on his fastball and the break on his breaking balls, and his career really runs out of steam very quickly after that. Nearly a decade after winning that championship at Sunlight Park, he returned for another stint with the Torontos, but he was a shell of his former self. The Globe said that players were wanted, the baseball team had to be strengthened because the current players weren't good enough. And that supposed phenomenon, Ned Crane, has been shown up in a bad light. He came back the following season, played a game here in July against Toronto, and the Torontos just beat him around the diamond. The once mighty name, the Globe said, has lost its magic. It no longer inspires dread or fear. That he essayed to pitch for Springfield against Toronto over the dawn yesterday afternoon, and he made a sorry exhibition of himself. The home team sized up his delivery and with consummate ease pounded the ball all over the lot. Crane's career only had weeks left at that point, and his life, too. That was July of 1896. Just 2 months later, he was staying at a hotel in Rochester when the hotel asked him to pay his overdue bill. He went upstairs to his room and drank a bottle of chloral, taking his own life. That Crane is no more, as the Globe reported. It was, of course, big news in Toronto, the city where he was so celebrated. A tragic end to his story, but a story that would live on. Cannonball Crane was a hero to many Toronto baseball fans, along with the other notorious figures of 1887 and that first pennant for the baseball club. And their story would be told and retold, especially Crane's, for generations to come. They had given our city its first spectacular, exhilarating month of championship caliber baseball. In that 15-game winning streak, they managed to score 190 runs. That's 13 or so on average every single day, with the opponents only scoring 5 on average. So an average win of 8 runs. And Crane had been right in the middle of it. Of those 15 games, Crane started 10 of them, and he finished all 10. 10 complete games out of 15, playing center field almost all the rest of the games, driving or scoring the winning run and another one, gunning that runner down at home plate. And he finished that season not only with a .428 batting average, but with a .248 earned run average. One of the most spectacular single-season performances in the history of our city. He ended up winning 33 games for the Torontos that year, which is more than any other Toronto pitcher playing professionally has ever won, before or after. And so Cannonball Crane, 140 years nearly after that championship pennant flew from the pine tree on that train, is still very much remembered in our city, if you know where to look. There used to be a Cannonball Cafe on the spot where the stadium once stood. You'll find a plaque there now that mentions him in the 15-game winning streak. There's a mural of him in the stairwell of the Broadview Hotel just across the street. They've even got a Cannonball lager at Left Field Brewery dedicated to his honor. And just a year after all of this, and Crane's passing and that sad end of his life, well, a new era in Toronto's baseball history would begin, this time out on the island. And so that's the era we're going to start looking at through the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs Baseball Club next month, when we're back on Zoom Friday, April 17th for a lecture about the bizarre and the unlikely. So I hope you'll be able to register for that free talk as well. Also, very quickly mention that I've got a public Zoom course that I'm offering Thursday nights starting next week, all about the history of riots in Toronto. It's all pay what you like, and you just have to find out more information on my website, which is just myname.com, adambunch.com.